Welcome, everybody, to the Gloria Ferrer Masterclass series. We're going to be discussing the evolution of style. My name is Kyle Altamari. I'm the winemaker here at Gloria Ferrer, and I'm here with Brad Kurtz, our vineyard director.
Masterclass number two.
Masterclass number two. Here we go. We have a very fun outline for our viewers tonight. We're going to be talking about some stories from the history of Gloria Ferrer, where we're going, what we're doing. We're also going to be talking about how our wines started in terms of style, the ranches were planted. We're going to be talking about how blends are created and what we look at when we're sitting down to actually craft these wines that we're so passionate about making for you. So let's get some wine in the glass, and you feel free to do as well.
Yeah, let's pop some bubbles. Yeah. Join us at home if you got something to drink. So, the first thing we're going to talk about today is a little bit about the history of the vineyards, why things are the way they are. Why are the vineyards planted the way that they are planted? So, we've got a nice map up here. If you can see the presentation, the map is of our home ranch here. It's a 200-acre estate vineyard in the heart of Carneros that surrounds our beautiful winery. This vineyard was originally planted first in 1984. So, 1984, what does Carneros look like, Kyle?
1984, Carneros has just been in AVA for 1 year. The Ferrer family has owned this property for 2 years and is starting to put roots in the ground here, literally and figuratively. And
Good dad
Carneros there are not any other wineries making sparkling wine at this time in Carneros. Gloria Ferrer was the first. You're looking at planting Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and I wanted to just have a discussion here about why did we plant those varietals, Brad? Why were we looking at Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and how did it come about? 330 acres contiguous over 2 ranches is a lot of land to plant. So
yeah,
let's discuss first and foremost the home ranch.
Yeah. So Pinot Noir and Chardonnay are the classic grapes of sparkling wine. They're the champagne grapes, 2 of the 3 major champagne grapes, and probably the 2 most coveted for quality sparkling wines throughout the world. We have, Chardonnay, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, but the style that Chardonnay brings and the style that Pinot Noir brings, they play together very well in sparkling wines. And the Ferrer family knew this when they planted their vineyards. So if we look at the map here, we have the historical names of the different vineyard blocks, if you will, the different sites within the home ranch. We have Willow Springs, which was a section in the kind of center of the ranch. We refer to it on the technical side as A block.
Yep.
A block was A block because it was planted first.
The first one.
So, very creative naming. But the first thing they did is they put down about 30 acres of Chardonnay. So the first year they planted, they put down about 30 acres of Chardonnay. The next year that was followed by, you guessed it, B block. B block was another 30 to 40 acres of Pinot Noir. So they started with about equal, maybe a little bit more Pinot Noir than Chardonnay, but equal proportions because they knew that they were going for that blended style versus Blanc de Blanc or Blanc de Noir. They were going for a blended style sparkling wine, a Cuvée sparkling wine that's made with the 2 main grapes.
Not to say that you couldn't make either of them. You can still blend it, but again, the property was kind of split side to side like that.
And when you're planting a vineyard, you have to have a style of wine in mind.
Yep.
So when those vineyards were first planted, clonal choices were pretty limited. So back in the 80s, you didn't have all the, we have all these clones that we can choose from now. I mean, you go on the UC Davis Foundation Plant Services website and you pull up Chardonnay, you can scroll for a long time.
So before we get too deep into that, can you explain to me what a clone is? Like,
of course.
Give me the 5-word answer about not 5 words.
I don't know about 5 words.
The shortened version, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about clones, because you'll hear that word a lot tonight when we're talking about this. What is a clone?
And we'll for sure dive into clones more in other master classes, but a clone at its essence is a genetically identical vine to a mother vine. So what happens throughout the history of wine growing is that in these old vineyards, you have grapes that are growing, usually older vines, and to plant a new vineyard, we're not planting seeds. We don't use seeds to plant vineyards. If you plant a seed, you don't know what you're gonna get when you plant a grape seed. It may not even produce grapes. So what's important is we wanna know what we're gonna, if we plant a vineyard, we want it to be Pinot Noir, we need to make sure we're getting genetic Pinot Noir material to plant. So there's two ways to do that. You take a cutting and you stick that stick in the ground, and it will put down roots. It will actually grow roots out of that stick and have a vine grow out of it. Or you take that cutting and you graft it onto a rootstock, which is an important distinction. We have phylloxera here in California, which is a pest that feeds on the roots of vines. So it's important that we use rootstocks.
Not good.
But when you walk through these old vineyards, these old vineyard managers, viticulturists, vignerons, they would look for anomalies in the vineyard. They would look for things that are different and in a good way, whether that's a vine that has bigger clusters, more berries per cluster, bigger berries, smaller berries, tighter clusters, looser clusters, more vigorous, more color, more acid, more tannin, whatever you're looking for in your wines. Pinot Noir is very genetically unstable. So what happens...
It's exhibiting a stylistic character that you're looking for.
Something happened within that bud where something mutated, and that vine is exhibiting a characteristic because on that bud of the mother vine that you then grafted, you've created a whole new vine that has those characteristics. So what they're doing is they're going to look for those. They're going to take cuttings of those and they're going to plant new vineyards with those cuttings. Those cuttings then become a clone of the parent material.
Got it.
Now, in the modern day, we look at clones as registered. They're clean of virus. There's a lot of other technical aspects that go into something being a clone. And it's registered with the state of California. There's a lot of technical aspects. It's been quarantined. There's things that we look at for clones that are more than just that. But at the essence of it, it is a genetically identical copy of another vine that we've propagated vegetatively. So there's your 5-word or so definition.
Add a couple zeros to it.
Yeah.
You got it. So let's continue with the home ranch. So we've got Pinot Noir, genetically unstable, right? It's very good at assuming the site and the vintage. And then we've got Chardonnay, pretty good at taking on longevity approach, holds its acid a little bit better, takes on the winemaker or the hands that are working with it a little bit better. Let's talk about how this ranch was actually planted, because you've talked about Willow Springs A block and B block as you and I refer to it, and that's how we look at it in a technical aspect. But then there's a lot more on this ranch here on this map that we're looking at. And give me an idea of, after they've planted these first 2 blocks, where do we go from there?
Yeah, so we planted a series of blocks after that, all the way from A to G on the home ranch, in which we planted initially with these sort of heritage clones that we had in California. Things like Wente clone, things like Martini clone. A lot of them are named after famous growers or wineries in California that are these older wineries. We have the Wadenswil 2A, which is from Switzerland, actually. All of these are clones that were basically pre-prohibition clones that were here in California before that time. Then essentially they finished planting the home ranch and then kind of disaster struck. We had a phylloxera outbreak here, which wasn't just isolated to Gloria Ferrer. It's kind of one of the great modern tragedies of the wine industry in California. Is in the late 80s to late 90s, essentially, a huge portion of California vineyards were wiped out due to phylloxera. But what that does is it gives you the opportunity to replant. So you learn a lot when you plant a vineyard and you're able to evolve. A lot of these they were able to save some of the vineyards. They were able to interplant them to keep those older vines going. They were able to, some of them they had to rip out completely and replant. But you learn something on the first time. You're able to plant on resistant rootstock and you're able to keep the vineyard going.
Perfect. And then there was a lot of stuff done here at Gloria that was very forward-thinking, very pioneering. So as we're planting this out, let's talk a little bit. We've delved into clones, and we said there's some heritage clones here. We've got 2A, we've got Wadenswil, we've got Wente, we've got all of these different clones that are kind of native to California or famous from California regions. But what makes Gloria Ferrer different? Because there's a lot of blocks on this property now, and even back then that we're still working with now, that nobody else has. So what happened in trying to figure out how to plant this ranch that we ended up with such a series of different clonal material?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. We can talk about we should probably talk about what happened first, which was the Massal selections.
Yep.
So Massal selections, where clones are the descendant of one vine, Massal selections are the descendant of an entire vineyard. So instead of taking one vine and just propagating a whole vineyard off of one vine, you're taking an entire vineyard, you're taking cuttings from a lot of the vines. Usually you pick the healthiest ones or the ones that are exhibiting the characteristics you want, and you plant a mixed genetic material vineyard off of that. So we have a heritage selection, Massal selection here on the site that's been propagated many times over by the vineyard team. So that selection was originally known as the Wente selection. Now we call it the Gloria selection, the Gloria Massal selection. That selection is something that no one else has. It is a result of the selections that our vineyard managers and viticulturists have done over the last 40 years, have selected vines, they flag vines, you take cuttings from those vines and plant them. No one else has that. So that's one thing. And that's from the original plantings in B block that have been propagated over and over again. We're on something like the 5th generation of selecting these vines.
And this is something that you and I are continuing today as we look through and we say, these are vines that are exhibiting characteristics that we want. Some of the stuff we touched on last time, a lack of color, lack of tannin, where we get very
fantastic acidity,
very good acid retention, slow sugar accumulation, things that we get that are tailored to
sparkling wine,
but sparkling wine on this property, right? Because if you're 5 miles down the road, we're in a completely different.
We're selecting different vines to replant the vineyard.
Exactly.
Yes.
So it's something that has been passed to us, and we're continuing to carry on as the evolution of our house style.
That vineyard selection is physically evolving as our style changes, as our style evolves, as the site evolves, as the climate evolves. That vineyard selection is evolving with it. So it's a living thing versus a clone, which is every time you plant that clone, it's genetically identical.
Yep.
So then the next thing that happened was the Gloria Ferrer team in the 90s traveled to Champagne. They traveled to Champagne and they brought back 6 clones actually of Chardonnay and 12 clones of Pinot Noir, specifically for sparkling wine production. And so those were planted, and a lot of research was done over the years on these sparkling wine clones from Champagne and how they perform here. There was a lot of research done in collaboration with UC Davis, 2 different clonal studies for sparkling wine specifically, which had never been done in California. There was no research on what clones worked well for sparkling wine. All the research was based on still wine, because that's the majority of the industry in California. And it was done right here on our home ranch. So it's a beautiful thing that we were able to get all this fantastic research, looking at yields, looking at chemistries of the wines, looking at the vigor of the vines, how they performed, whether they were healthy or not. We have all this research going back to the 80s on these vines. And we can move forward in the presentation and look at the clonal story here. We'll come back to we'll circle back to the Circle Bar Ranch a little bit later.
Come back a little later.
That's a little later in the story. But if we look, it's a huge process. It's a super long process here to get to a production vineyard from importing a clone. There's lots of quarantine periods. I've touched on this a little bit, but there's a little more to being a clone and a registered clone than just taking a cutting from a mother vine and planting it. There's a lot that goes into it. One vine can only produce enough buds to do maybe 50 new vines. So you have to exponentially grow your material, your genetic material, to plant a commercial sized vineyard, which takes, every time you expand it, it takes another 3 years. So you go from 50 buds to 2,500 buds and you expand out every time, and it's an exponential growth, but eventually you need to get to commercial size volumes. And so this, plus the research, all of that, you're looking at least a 20-year project that this was.
So it's an investment, right?
It's a huge investment in both time and money that the Gloria Ferrer team did. But we are now planting these clones, and we're seeing phenomenal quality off them. Every year, these clones are producing our best quality lots. When we do our grading tasting, it's all completely blind, and we're blown away.
These are the wines that go into Royal Cuvée. They go into Royal Cuvée Rosé, as you guys are tasting tonight. These are the wines that go into Carneros Cuvée Rosé, and we're strategically looking at these for specific purposes.
Yeah.
And it's proven that this study, while it took a lot of time, is worth every bit that we've put into it and continue to.
And not only that, as we continue to evolve and replant our vineyards, we're able to look at the data. We have a mountain of data from all of these studies that were done on our. What more can a viticulturist ask for but to have mountains of research of data on their vineyard that they're farming? You know, most of the time it's in Oakville or Davis or it's at a research vineyard somewhere, but we have it from our own home here.
It's best when the research happens on our site.
In your soils, in your climate, with your farming methods.
Yeah, so let's quickly go back and talk about Circle Bar Ranch here just for a quick second, because I do want to talk about some other things as well with soil and with other things. But we have another ranch just down the road, about a mile as the crow flies.
Yep, a mile south.
And this ranch was planted a little bit later.
Yep.
So I think this was started in 97.
97 they began planting it, yep.
Let's talk a little bit about the difference here, because even though there's these fanciful names up on the screen, most of this ranch is planted to Pinot Noir, where you have a fairly even split, a little bit Pinot heavy on the home ranch, but most of this ranch is planted to Pinot Noir. So again, going back and touching here, you also have a lot of different topography. You can see this is a much different site than the other one. So talk to me about how you look at farming these two different parcels of land.
Yeah, so where the home ranch is mostly these beautiful, deep, fertile valley floor soils, which are phenomenal for sparkling wine. The Circle Bar Ranch is a little different. It's all these undulating hillsides. You have different exposures, different slopes, lots of different soils, everything from super shallow, stressed, rocky sites, which are great for still wines, for red wine especially.
Up in the top of the
Up on the top of the hills, on the ridges there, all the way down to the valley floor stuff and everything in between. So there's a lot of options here for blending purposes. It gives you, as the artist, a lot of colors to paint with, right?
It's a winemaker's dream, I can tell you that.
Yeah, we have, there's probably 10 different clones at least of Pinot planted at Circle Bar, plus the Chardonnay that's there. And even the same clone, you move, 100 yards east, west, north, south, and the soils are completely different and that clone shows completely differently.
Yep.
So it's something that from a stylistic standpoint, we can play with a lot. We have a lot of options.
It gives you options. It gives you also logistically, because at the end of the day, we are run by people, and people do matter. And having that week that we get in between, from being a mile down the road where it's 2-3 degrees cooler in the growing season, having a Pinot Noir dominated vineyard, giving you that extra week means all the difference.
Yeah.
The harvest is 3 weeks long. Getting 33% more time really helps.
Makes a difference. Yeah. And, Circle Bar, the Chardonnay, they're special too. It's some of the last vineyards that we pick every year.
Yep.
It's in the coolest sites at the bottom of the hills, really close to the bay there, and it produces some phenomenal Chardonnay as well.
I do like the Chardonnay that comes from that property, because when you have it, it exhibits such different base characteristics that when you get it in the fermenter, you can tell, okay, these are wines that are going to be driven a bit more on texture. They're going to be driven a bit more on mouthfeel. It lends itself towards these wines that we lay down to reserve, for 5, 7, 20 plus years for our extended tirage wines, right? So it gives you a little bit of a spice to play with as you can layer these
part of your spice rack,
which is really nice, just to have the different soils, to have the different aspect ratios, to create a same grape, oftentimes same clone, like you said, but create something so distinctly different. Now, you're a soil scientist by trade.
Yes.
Let's start talking about dirt. I don't think you'll have a problem talking about dirt.
Don't get me started, man.
So let's talk about, you took over this farming practice in 2021. What was one of the first things that you did here?
So, one of the first things I did is I really took an inventory of what we had. Whenever you walk into a new situation, especially a new vineyard where it has so much history and there's so much going on, even the things like our home ranch, which are seemingly flat and seemingly uniform, even now we're figuring out all the different nuances within those sections that on paper should be fairly uniform and fairly straightforward. We're figuring out how to splice them up a little bit more, how to treat sections of blocks differently than other sections of the same block. And so taking an inventory of everything was really important, especially from a stylistic standpoint. We had to really understand what we had and understand all these clones that are very unique to Gloria Ferrer They're no matter how much experience you have in the wine industry, these are new clones, these are new sites, all of that. So that was the first thing. The second thing we did is we decided everything was going to switch to organic farming, and that's something we talked about a lot in the last masterclass. But we'll touch on it probably a little bit in every masterclass because it is so important.
It's a big point of what we do.
And so we transitioned to organic farming. We looked at our pruning. Pruning's a big thing. I have an awesome team that is amazing pruners, but you can always get better. And so we brought in a new style of pruning that is a little bit different. It helps with the sap flow in the vine and making sure the sap doesn't, we don't have dry wood that kinks the sap flow, and we have, better growth, better connection from the fruit and the leaves of the vines down to the roots, and that there's no interrupted connection there. A lot of that stuff is very nuanced, and, I can't speak highly enough about my team because, I love working here because I have such an amazing group of people that have so much experience that I can teach this stuff to, and they're here year after year, and we can continue to evolve and to learn and to be able to experiment and try new things and see how it affects the wines. And then at the end of the day, the switch to organic farming, we see the balance in the vines. We see the balance come back. And when I talk about balance, it's kind of an esoteric.
Yeah.
It's up in the air. You don't know what it's a difficult concept to grasp. But the way I put it is balance in a vineyard is all about having balance between your canopy and your crop load. So how many leaves and how exposed those leaves are to the sun and how much fruit you have out in the vineyard. And that really is the basis of quality wine growing. And so bringing that back into balance with organic farming, making sure these vines are fed well with compost that breaks down slowly and feeds the vines slowly throughout the season so that they do not crash, they don't explode with growth and then crash, that they're sustained throughout the season and continue to develop flavors and textures within the grapes all season long. And so that's part of what we did. We have some images here of pruning, we have some sheep, we have all that stuff. All that stuff is part of organic farming that helps build the soils back, helps sustain the vines, helps them be more resilient to temperature swings. And then what we saw in the wines, we're just disgorging kind of the first of the 2021s, right? The first of the 2021s, it's my fourth vintage here, and I'm finally getting to taste the wines from that first year.
And it takes a while.
We taste them along the way, but it's that finished product that really matters, right? That's what the consumer's tasting. That's what all our wine club members are tasting. All our customers around the world are tasting. And so tasting those wines compared to previous vintages, the previous vintages are all phenomenal wines, but as those 2021s come into production, we're seeing the style change. And part of it was intentional, but part of it was a result of the shift to organic farming, I believe, and the shift in just our mentality of farming, of going vine by vine, making sure each vine is balanced individually. All of that is really changed the style. And maybe you could talk more about that and in more eloquent words than I can.
Yeah, I really see it as an evolution, right? And I like to use the term evolution, not revolution. When you think of it, evolution is slow to change. You just mentioned it. You've been here 4 years, and we're just getting to taste the first wines, the sparkling wines. That's a long time to wait.
You have to be very patient in this game.
That's the early to release wines, like our Brut Rosé and our Zero Dosage Rosé that's coming out. But it's an evolution of trying to maintain the stylistic integrity of wines, but just elevate them to a new level where we get them and they exhibit more weight on the palate. We can use less sugar. We can use less winemaking techniques because we're doing everything right in the vineyard. We're taking care of the vines. We're taking care of the entire ranch. This is everything that you see up on the slides that we have up here. This is about creating an ecosystem. And like you said, your team touches all these vines individually by hand. And yes, we do have machines to help us and do things like that, but the evolution of style really comes from the fact that we've been handed a property and a winery that has been phenomenal for 40 years. And what can we do to make sure that we're leaving this in better condition than we got it for the vineyard managers and winemakers after us? And it's a tall task, especially when, if you and I have a long storied career, we may see 5 vintages of Carneros Cuvée disgorged.
Yeah, I mean,
Right?
it's
If you work here for 25 years, you get 5 vintages of Royal Cuvée disgorged.
Yeah.
It's kind of humbling, right? Where you're
No,
laying
of course.
these things down. You've laid down 20 wines, but you only get to finish 5 of them. So it's really interesting to see these vineyards really come to life as we've moved to this organic farming, as we've moved to making sure that what we're doing is for the health of the total property and not destroying the ecosystem around it.
Yeah.
I think, talk to me a little bit about like when we have these special clones that are unique to Gloria Ferrer, how do we get them? How do we get our hands on them?
Yeah, so it's a whole process. I talked a little bit about how, you have to turn one vine into 50 vines, into 2,500 vines. And each time you do that, it takes 3 to 5 years to do that. So we've been lucky enough, by the time these vines, this whole vineyard, both Circle Bar and the home ranch, were fully developed is when basically this project ended. And so what we did is we partnered with UC Davis, and there's a thing called Foundation Plant Services, which is essentially a library of clonal material for the state of California, where we can deposit some vines, donate the material. It then becomes available to anybody if they want them, if they request them. But those vines live at UC Davis. They're taken very good care of there. They're kept disease-free. They're maintained properly. And then when we're ready to essentially take a withdrawal from the bank or from the library, if you will, we submit some paperwork. They send us some budwood, and we're able to plant vineyards with that. That being said, they have 4 vines of each clone. 4 vines, you're lucky if you get 50 buds of each vine. Of those 50 buds, maybe 35 of them are viable. So we have these small lots that we have to start with, and we have to build them back up to commercial size vineyards. So this year, in F5, which is just below the winery next to the garden, we planted 6 rows of Chardonnay. 6 rows, each of a different clone. So there's 40 vines in each row, and we have 6 rows, 6 different clones of Chardonnay. Those are our 6 sparkling wine clones that the Gloria Ferrer team imported back in the 90s. Those 40 vines in 3 years, we'll be able to plant another 2,000 or so vines. And so from those 2,000 vines, we'll be able to then plant a commercial size vineyard. So we'll start with a 1 to 2 acre vineyard, and then be able to go to a 5 to 10 acre vineyard from there. So when you look at Circle Bar, if you go back to the Circle Bar map, we have a block there where we have down along the creek there at the bottom in the northeast corner of the block of the ranch, we have a vineyard where we have 1.5 acres of 4 different Pinot clones. And those are ones that we've been able to do experiments with. We've been able to continue. Last year, we did some micro fermentations where we did, 20 gallons of each clone. And we're able to do some sensory analysis on them and look at them from that standpoint. Which ones do we want to focus on replanting in which areas? So those were kind of the middle step, right? Where they planted those. And then they just didn't have anywhere to put them after that because all the ranches were planted out. But now we have those, and they've been kept there. So we have 4 clones there that we're able to plant that are already ready to go in commercial size volumes.
It's one of my favorite blocks to work with. And like you said earlier, it's been our dream because we inherited so much research on this specific property. And it was fantastic to have that in terms of what do you do when you're planting a vineyard? What are the pruning weights? What are the lag weights? What kind of tonnage are you going to get? Is this commercially viable? But you and I took it one step further and said, okay, we need to know what these taste like at our property, which is where the small lot came in. And then this year, when we picked it, it's really odd to see because there are 4 clones, all within a 1.5 acre parcel, 1.5, 2 acre parcel, and they're literally feet apart. And
same soils, pruned the same time.
Exactly. You go through that block top to bottom, but it was a week between picking 2 of the clones, A and C, and then B and D were even farther behind that. So it's very interesting to see.
Tons of variation between, they're all Pinot Noir, they're all the same rootstock, everything's the same except for the fact that they're different clones. And so we can really see the differences in them. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to do the same thing with Chardonnay in F5 there, where we just planted those 6 different clones. And we'll be able to do the same thing in 3 to 4 years.
I'm
Everything's a waiting game here.
It's hurry up and wait. That's
hurry up and wait.
With winemaking, that's always, and grape growing, that's always how it goes.
So I want to switch gears a little bit, and we talked a little bit about Pinot and Chardonnay, and about how Pinot and Chardonnay are the kind of historic, most revered sparkling wine grapes. Why don't you talk to me a little bit about the differences between Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, what they bring to a blend, what they are like in the vineyard, all of that sort of thing.
So Pinot Noir, again, we touched on this earlier. I think Pinot Noir is amazing at taking on the site and the vintage. In warm vintages, you get a very ripe style, a lot of red fruits coming through, lower acid, much softer body, very elegant wines. In cold vintages, you retain your acidity, but you have this nice floral aspect to the wines. It's unique to each site. And like we just
It can be a little
about,
spicy.
It can be spicy, and especially as it ages.
Baking spices.
It's really nice to put in a
earthy.
blend that's going to age, right? Because you go towards that cinnamon, that nutmeg, that clove. We get that kind of spiced apple note coming through. It really drives the style of a wine based on the vintage. It's great at capturing the history, right? As I like to look at it. Chardonnay, on the other hand, is a perfect complement to Pinot Noir, because where Pinot Noir is very vibrant in its youth and very elegant as it ages.
Soft and elegant.
Yeah, that aging process happens a little bit faster. So it doesn't have the same content, phenolic content there when we're talking. The structure of the grape is not the same, is what I'm saying. So we need Chardonnay to balance it. And Chardonnay really is very good at taking on the hands that work with it, the people in the vineyard. You know, if you grow it correctly, it's going to be phenomenal. If you work with it correctly in the winery, it takes on what you want it to take on. The other benefit there is it provides a lot of aging potential for our wines. So what we're looking at when we're talking about these blends is we're always trying to strike this balance between making sure that we are making wines that are true to this property, true to this site, true to the vintage, because I do think that that's one of the greatest things about making sparkling wine is it's vintage driven, right? There's no, like we said in the last Masterclass, there's no place to hide when you're making sparkling wine. You don't have tannin, you don't have color, you don't have
oak, you don't have malolactic, you don't have anything.
You have nothing, there's nowhere to hide. So showcasing what Mother Nature gave us and how well we took care of the property that we have is really what shines through in these wines. But you always need to strike a balance between making sure that a wine has layers and complexity and has ageability. It needs to be approachable when it's young, but it needs to last for extended periods of time, especially with something like Royal Cuvée, which we're drinking today. With our Royal Cuvée lots, we just disgorged the 2006 extended tirage.
Yeah.
So it's 18 years in tirage before we pull it out. It's got to have some structure there. So that's where we talk about, and this is we actually have a video about our Royal Cuvée. So I think that's a really good spot to let's take a little quick look at this video.
Great.
And then we can come and talk about actual blend percentages and things like that.
Our Royal Cuvée is more than just a wine. It's a legacy of intention that began in 1987, when the Ferrer family served the first vintage to the King and Queen of Spain. Ever since, it's been a testament to our passion for quality. Royal Cuvée is remarkably balanced. It's a dance between the dominance of Pinot Noir with its vivacious fruitiness, and the balance of Chardonnay, which lends structure and longevity. The result is a wine that evolves gracefully throughout its extended aging process. Its journey begins at our Carneros Estate vineyards, where we handpick these grapes every vintage. We cautiously press them in whole clusters to preserve their delicate vibrancy and blend each vintage carefully for optimal quality and aging capability. This wine then ferments in stainless steel tanks to maintain those pristine characteristics, and finally is laid to rest for 5 years on the yeast. Aromas of light citrus and apple lead into a burst of fresh green apple, crisp pear, and subtle lemon zest on the palate. The fine, delicate bubbles create a full mouthfeel, and the perfect blend of creamy Chardonnay and rich Pinot Noir culminates in a lovely, lingering finish. Royal Cuvée is not just a sparkling wine. It's a journey through time and a testament to the quality of the fruit that goes into each bottle, our traditional method of winemaking, and our dedication to crafting a wine that evolves not just in complexity, but in character as well.
I love that video. I get chills every time we watch it, because when you see that video, you feel the intention, you feel the passion, you feel everything that we're doing, and then you get to taste it in the glass when we're tasting it right now. It is
chills.
Phenomenal. So again, that's our Royal Cuvée. So again, we talked about Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Pinot Noir really becomes that softer approach to winemaking. Pinot Noir is a fickle mistress, if you will. You know how it is to grow it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think when I first came here and I was able to taste the base, I mean, tasting base wines is something that you don't really do unless you're a sparkling winery. And tasting the Chardonnay versus the Pinot, I mean, it's like night and day. They're like, when you taste them in when they're blended together, they pair so well and they blend so seamlessly, but separately, they're completely different animals.
They couldn't be more worlds apart, where you get that soft spiciness and that elegance to Pinot Noir that really develops quickly in the glass and in its aging process. Chardonnay is that muscle that gives it the backbone, as I like to say.
Yeah.
I like to say you build a wine around the structure, and then you hang the elegance and the intrigue on it. And Pinot Noir, as fickle as it is really a winemaker and viticulturist's and vineyard manager's wine, because when you get it right, it is so good.
Yeah,
there's a sense of accomplishment
but it is
there.
so hard to
But
get
it's so fickle. It doesn't.
But that
like
being said,
sun. It doesn't like water. It doesn't like too much water.
all of our wines, not all of them, but a majority of our wines and our house style is driven by Pinot Noir.
It is.
So like, why do you think originally, and we have continued throughout the last 40 years of being a Pinot Noir house and making Pinot Noir, because that's not the norm in California. Chardonnay is the historical sparkling wine grape for California.
Yep.
Why Pinot Noir at Gloria Ferrer?
Again, because of its expressiveness. When you can create wines that, when they are crafted with intention and they are cared for in this organic style that we're farming and now carrying that intention all the way through the winery, you get wines that are so expressive that really showcase the heart and soul of what Gloria Ferrer is. And that is passion, forward thinking, and intentionality. Right? We've always been about innovation. When we planted, when the Ferrers planted this ranch, nobody else was doing that.
Yeah.
It's always been the ethos of what we're doing, is to create wines that have a true personality and a true sense of style. And I think Pinot Noir is, again, when done right, a very good way to do that.
I would agree with you.
Again, Chardonnay, I think, is such a necessary component of the blend, especially when we're talking about laying wines down for a long time. You have to have that structure. You have to have the backbone. You have to have the ageability there that allows that Pinot Noir to be protected so that it can age gracefully, that it doesn't just fall
And
right
I mean,
off the cliff.
we just opened up a 91 Carneros Cuvée, and it was still phenomenal wine. 1991. That wine is
34 years old.
33, 34 years old. And for a sparkling wine to still be kicking like that,
Yep.
they're doing something right. And the blend hasn't changed that much.
No, and when we talk about these changes, they're very minor, but they're very intentional and they're very calculated, right? Farming organically has allowed us to take the final step of the process, which is dosage. And just a quick recap, since we touched on this last time, dosage is what I like to say, putting weights on the balance, right? And you want to make sure that you put weights in between acid and sweetness, right? So it's that balance, that final balance between sweet and tart, which are two things that people love.
And body as well.
Body. And you add that with a final liqueur, and you do it in a way that doesn't overshadow the wine.
It's your final tweak that you can make to the wine before it goes out to the
one
world.
stamp that you get to say, this is what that wine is supposed to be. And since working with the wines from prior to 2021 and now getting into the 2021s when we started farming organically, what we're seeing is when we're using dosage, and you've walked through these trials with us as well, we set up a series and we look at things down in, with Carneros Cuvée, we get as granular as 0.1 grams per liter. We're talking very, 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 very...
A pinch of sugar
yes.
per bottle,
If you could
maybe
put
less.
2 grains of salt on your steak. That's what we're talking about changing.
Yeah.
Here. But what we've done is we've taken that and we've reduced the amount of sugar that we need to use to make the wines come into balance. And we've done that through farming organically, because when you get better quality base wines, you get better quality finished product. And it all starts there and continues through. It's also about looking at things and making blend percentage changes when you're talking about sparkling wine. You know, when you're talking about having wines that lay down for upwards of 20 years, you need to be very careful about making a drastic 20-30% change. You can't do that. So that's where it becomes the evolution.
You can tweak it, but you don't want to reinvent the whole wheel.
We are, as the vineyard evolves, as the climate evolves, as we evolve as a business and winemakers and vineyard managers, the style evolves as well. And it's really about showcasing that it's being cared for in the right way. We're getting higher quality wines, so we can be a little bit more expressive one way or the other. So minor tweaks that make a big difference.
There's a balance point. There's a sweet spot the wine hits. When you taste through, you start with a little bit of sugar and you end with a really sweet wine, and you find that sweet spot where it comes into balance. And with the organically farmed grapes, it seems like that balance point is tipping to less sugar for whatever reason. It's got more weight, potentially. It's more balanced. It doesn't need that sugar to come into and feel like a whole complete wine.
Yeah, and as consumer taste change, as palates evolve over what we're tasting, people are looking for a lot of expression. And when you put sugar on top of something, it lowers the amount of expression that you get. Your mouth can only handle so much.
Yes.
Right? If you have all spice and no sweetness, it tastes completely
It's like drenching your steak in hot sauce.
Exactly what it is. You don't get to taste any of the beef, but you can sure taste that hot sauce. So we're always trying to strike that balance in between the base wines showing through and creating a sense that it has elegance, it has intrigue, and it's got the final weight that we're looking for. And that bar where we start has come down roughly about 20% as the first year of organic farming. As it takes a long time for those organic methods to take place, this will actually be the first vintage in 2025. 2025 will be the first time that we're organically certified. And you started farming that way in 21. So as those changes start to come into the wines, you're going to start seeing that bar go even lower, and start to get there. But it's also about looking at things and dosing. I call it dosing with intentionality. It means there are no recipes. There are no rules when we do this. Yes, we have government rules. I know that. But we are looking at each wine for what it is. And with the Royal wines that we're tasting right now, for me, it's all about texture. Yeah. These wines are very texture-driven wines. Royal Cuvée and Royal Cuvée Rosé are all about how does this wine feel. It's soft. It's Pinot Noir dominant, so it's soft, it's luxurious, it's elegant, it's spicy. It's got a lot of things going on. Again, with the rosé, it kind of jumps out of the glass with the aromatics and
with the bubbles. The bubbles really make it pop.
They take it. That's the best thing about sparkling wine. They take the aromatics to you. You don't have to go looking. They'll take it right to you. And with the Royal Cuvée, it's really about the texture of laying down for 4 years in tirage and 1 under cork before we release it. Again, so these wines have an investment in them from just the amount of time that we lay them down before we even dose them. Yeah. We're looking at 5 years. And these wines really exhibit a sense of place and a sense of vintage. You can stick your nose in the glass from one Royal Cuvée to the next, and they both smell like Royal Cuvée. They both taste like Royal Cuvée, and they feel like Royal Cuvée, but they're so stylistically parallel. Yeah. They're not over each other where it's the same wine, but they're running along the same track right next to each other, showcasing what this property was in 2015, and we're tasting the 2018.
And that's the Pinot, right? That's the Pinot. So talking about like using Royal Cuvée as an example, as we, evolve as the style of the wine, as the style of the farming, as the winemaking, as people's palates change, as climate changes, where do you see the blends going? And do you, obviously we talked about, you don't want to reinvent the wheel, because if you reinvent the wheel, I mean, it's a proven method. These wines are phenomenal year after year. Yes. But things are changing, right? Yep. The way we're farming is changing. The climate is evolving. Everything is shifting a little bit. And so how do you keep up with those shifts? And blend wise, how do you keep up with those shifts?
You really have to put an objective system in place. And that is something that started in 2021, and it's with the grading tasting. And we'll touch on this deeper in further master classes, but the essence is that we taste each wine blind as a vineyard management winemaking team. We all sit down. Nobody knows what the wines are. And we give them grade just like you would get in school, A, B, C. Then we talk about them and what we like about them, what we would improve about them. It's a report card of how the vineyard's doing. It's a report card of how well we continued that method in the winery. And it makes sure that when we are sitting down to make these blends, that we have the right components for the right wines. So it's really about putting an objective scale to something that is so subjective, which is the hardest thing to do. But that at least gives you a jumping off point. And then that's where the craft really comes in. That's where you get to sit down and go through, sometimes as many as 20 different blending trials before we finally decide something. Before people finally get so done with the winemaker, they're like, dude, you got to pick one.
You got to make a decision, man.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So it's basically you're able to take what the vintage throws at you
Correct.
and make the best blend
Correct.
regardless of which blocks are going into it, which
Yes.
sites are going into it, whether it's coming more from Circle Bar or the home ranch or things like that. You're able to keep similar blend percentages while adjusting based on the vineyard blocks and
Yes.
what the vintage gives you.
Yeah, and it's a challenging thing to do as a winemaker. Winemakers, we're definitely creatures of habit.
Yeah.
We find something that works, we like it, and that's the reason that, a house palate develops, right? So for me, it's really about making sure that you're constantly challenging the status quo. And it's either proof that you're doing it right, or it's proof that you did something better and that can become the new right.
Yeah.
Right? So it's, or it's proof that you tried something and it didn't work out, but you at least gain the knowledge to then evolve as a winemaker, and as a stylistic approach to crafting a wine. It continues over those periods of time. So it makes sure that you're honest. And
Keeps you honest.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's a great way to keep yourself honest is do it blind.
Yep.
And if you still come up with the same result, great. If not,
I always tell people, if you absolutely love a wine and you think this is the best wine that you've ever had, put it in a lineup blind and see if it's still, if it's more about what you think it should be or if it's what it actually is. And that's what the grading, tasting, and just looking at things with an intention to create the best sparkling wines in California, you have to be brutally honest. And those are sometimes tough conversations to have, but the objective part of this is where you jump off doing that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about different fermentation and aging vessels, things like that.
Yeah.
Ways that you're innovating, ways that you're adjusting to things, the ways you're trying to improve the wines, right? So I know that you guys have brought in a lot of different stuff, played with a lot of different stuff, done a lot of innovations.
Yep.
You and I both like to really, go pitch stuff out in left field sometimes and do some weird, innovative stuff. Yep. So what are some things that you guys are doing in the cellar to innovate a little bit, to play with style?
Sure.
You're not, most of the stuff you're not doing in large percentages.
Correct.
Most of the stuff is, as I understand, you're just 1 or 2% kind of things. Mm-hmm. But 1 or 2%, as we know, like with Dosage, can really bring a wine together. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in the historical style of Gloria Ferrer has been stainless steel driven. That's the only vessel we've used for sparkling wine. And it's been driven on Pinot Noir being picked just methodically. And I think what you and I are looking at is we need to look at this as a whole program and a whole vineyard, right? And so we're bringing in things in the winery that are tailored to the specific blocks that you're farming for specific purposes. So, we're looking at the Gloria Ferrer clones out in O Block, those 4 clones next to each other we mentioned. And, we took it and put it in stainless steel, we put it in oak, we put it in sandstone. And now we did it on a small scale, like you said, 1 to 2% of the non-traditional vessels as proof of concept. And the reason we do it that way is because if it works in a small scale, then you can gradually increase it to the point where it becomes commercially viable. So whenever we do these experiments, a lot of them do come out of left field, but we always have to make sure that it's something that we can actually implement that will make a meaningful change.
And you have to keep yourself honest, like we talked about. We'll taste these blind. We're not going to just open up the tap on the tank or pull some out of the barrel and be like, that's great, let's do it. We have to keep ourselves honest, and we'll taste them blind and we'll see, does it actually make a better wine?
Yeah.
Will we pick it out of a lineup and grade it higher than the same block that was treated differently in the cellar?
Correct. And that's why I always use the same block. So the experiment structure or style is the same block picked on the same day, fermented with the same yeast in 3 different vessels. And it's a very easy way to show what each individual vessel is doing because it's so controlled with the stuff that we start with. But the material we start with is consistent. Then the only changes are your experiment factors. It's a very experiment to say it worked, it didn't work. I like this, I don't like this. So it's about making these changes in a meaningful way that give a personality or give a desired outcome, and being honest about that outcome, and not just because you want the experiment to work, but does this work outside of the experimental parameters to the blending components as well? Can I use this in blends that create intrigue? So for instance, in 2023, we did this with Chardonnay. In 2024, we replicated it again with Chardonnay on a different block. And that's where we take it a step further for proof of concept. Okay, it worked on one. Is it isolated to that, or can we go farther? And then we said, okay, can it go to Pinot Noir as well? And the really fun thing is when you go in, and this is why I love doing experiments like this. We always have a biased thought in our mind, like I think it's going to do this, and then my hypothesis is completely shattered. Where what I thought it was going to do for Pinot Noir, it didn't, and it did two separate things for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. To then where it expands, and this is where it's about being honest. Okay, now I can take it a step further and say, well, that was great. Where do we go from here? So that's that slow evolution where we're talking 1 to 2% in 23, maybe 3 to 4 in 24, maybe a little bit less, but we're changing the blocks that we use, and just creating a stylistic evolution that is true to this property and these wines.
Yeah.
So
you don't want to reinvent the wheel,
no,
but you want to continue to improve it.
Yeah, just it's like listening to music. We're listening to the same record. We're just going to listen to it with surround sound. It's going to be a better experience.
Yeah.
And it's going to feel the same. You're going to hear the same music. But
So talking about these different vessels, I think is a good transition, because then we can talk a little bit about the innovation wines, because some of these experiments, you like what happens and you want to, you want to use them in the bigger blends, but you also want to showcase them as something different, because you don't want to change what Royal Cuvée is. Royal Cuvée is iconic. Carneros Cuvée is iconic. You don't want to change these amazing wines. You want to, but you still want to show your innovation. You still want to show these cool little experiments that we're doing and show them off in smaller scale. So why don't you talk a little bit about the innovation wines?
Yeah, so the innovation tier is such a fun tier to play around in, because you can really set your own rules and then break them if you want to. So, we've got an entire lineup devoted to these projects that we're innovating. We have a barrel fermented Barrica. We have coming out, we have some fun things. We have Rouge, a sparkling red wine. And that's one that I really, really love, because it's kind of
some of the zero dosage stuff.
We're going to zero dosage. And those are wines that you really have to be careful about creating, because again,
you have to have the right wines.
You have to have the right wines. They have to be made in the right style. We have sparkling Pinot Blanc. We do have a small bit of Pinot Blanc on the property here. We have a lot going on in that wine. That wine is tasting really good for summer.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that one.
So we'll get deeper into the innovation tier much later. There'll be a whole masterclass on it, but it's a tier of wines that we craft that are for a specific purpose, and you can really follow a single thread. You can make things that are intentionally what seems out of balance, but you follow this. I call it going.
You lean into it.
You just lean into it. You say that is what that wine wants to be. Take it up to another level. So that's a little bit about the evolution of style here at Gloria Ferrer, and what we've done from the vineyard all the way through the winemaking tier. And it's a really exciting time to be making wine here at Gloria.
So we talked about Gloria Ferrer sparkling wines being Pinot Noir dominant for the most part. Yeah. So we said Royal Cuvée is about 2/3 Pinot, 1/3 Chardonnay. What about some of the other wines? What about Royal Cuvée? I mean, sorry, Carneros Cuvée. We just said Royal Cuvée. Carneros Cuvée, sorry.
Yeah, so Carneros Cuvée, because
lots of cuvées.
Because it's going to lay down longer, you have to shift more of that percentage of Chardonnay in there. So Carneros Cuvée comes out at usually somewhere around 55% Pinot Noir, 45% Chardonnay. Again, you still want to be as expressive as you can. You want to showcase, again, another layer of ageability with Chardonnay, but also how does that Pinot age in that percentage for a longer period of time. With something that's like our Brut Rosé, that's early to release and is meant to be lively, fun, fruit-driven, really pop of that poppy, I call it punchy fruit, that Pinot Noir is known for. You need to have some Chardonnay in there just to balance it, but that's usually more about 92% Pinot, 8% Chardonnay, 90% Pinot, 10% Chardonnay. It depends on the vintage. We'll look at it and say, what does it need? Does it need a little bit more structure this year if it was a warmer vintage? Does it need a little less and need a little bit more elegance? We'll use that in a cooler vintage. And then you've got things like Royal Cuvée Rosé. It's a rosé that is released later than Brut Rosé. And that's where you shift more towards 70% Pinot, 33% Chardonnay.
Yeah.
So again, almost akin to its predecessor Royal Cuvée at 67-33, but you need that Chardonnay for ageability. And the way we differentiate this is color, but also Pinot signature. How are these blocks of Pinot Noir different? And that's where it's great to have all of those different blocks that we farm be able to work into wines that only 3% difference in Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but completely different wines. So
there's another grape that we haven't talked about
Yep.
that I think is important that we, briefly touch on, and that is Meunier. That is Pinot Meunier. So Pinot Meunier is kind of the third grape in Champagne.
Yep.
In California, it is planted in California. It is available, but at Gloria Ferrer, historically, it has not been planted. And I think that's because does not fit our terroir as well.
Yes.
It's a little more, our wines are more aged, and Meunier is not known for ageability.
No, it's definitely it's used to add fruit to young wines.
Yes.
It's also very resistant to frost. Luckily, we don't have a huge frost risk here. We're only about 7 miles from the bay.
Yeah.
That bay really protects us from deep. Sometimes we do get it, and we have frost protection on the vineyard, but that we don't need it. Where in Champagne, it was used to protect yourself.
It's an insurance policy
It's an insurance
against
policy.
frost.
And if you notice it, where most of where Pinot Meunier is planted in Champagne is down in the valleys, where that cold air settles.
down.
And we're talking historical vineyards. They don't have electricity. They don't have the frost protection or irrigation that we have. They have, cold air that just sits over it. So you need stuff that leaves out late. So,
And I think when you talk about a house style, is important to keep the history of that house style.
Exactly.
And we can innovate and we can introduce new grape varietals. We're not opposed to, playing around with like a sparkling Pinot Blanc, which is something we've grown for a long time. But it's not going to become a huge percentage of like a Royal Cuvée or
Correct.
Carneros Cuvée or Brut Rosé, these wines that are legacy wines for Gloria Ferrer. It's just, we have a house style that we want to maintain.
Yep.
So I haven't even touched my Royal Cuvée, so I'm going to pick that one up.
Yeah.
And
And we'll quickly talk about that, and then we will talk again at the next masterclass in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So Royal Cuvée is, again, this wine is all about texture. This wine should feel luxurious. It should feel unctuous. It should be soft, silky, creamy across the palate. You get that touch of yeast, just a little, but not as much as something like Carneros Cuvée, but a distinct difference from the Royal Cuvée.
for me, this wine is kind of the sweet spot between the aged character that you get from Carneros Cuvée and maybe the fresh, fruity, poppy, punchy character that you might get from like a Brut Rosé or even like Sonoma Brut or something like that, that's a lot fresher and younger and more vibrant. This is kind of hits the sweet spot between those two wines, and that's what I always get from Royal Cuvée.
It's a wine that it goes down so easy. It pairs with so many different things. It's a fun wine to make because the Pinot signature here is so distinct. And looking at these wines years over year over year, you see the style evolve and you see the style continue to get better and better.
And for me, this is a wine where Carneros Cuvée is a food wine that I truly believe that wine should be appreciated with food.
Yes.
And Sonoma Brut, maybe you can drink by itself.
Sure.
This is one that can kind of play in both sports. It can pair well with a ton of stuff, but it's also very drinkable on its own. So.
Yep. And with that, we will leave you to drink some Royal Cuvée and Royal Cuvée Rosé. And
Cheers.
We'll see you next time.